Okay, everybody at home, it's time to type in. Chris?
Yep.
Excuse me. Oh, God. Jose. Okay, so somebody at home, tell me that you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, first thing is that exam 3 is graded, and I'll be posting those scores later on. Probably I'm going to try to get them uploaded right after class because we do have lab this afternoon. I'd rather not wait to do it. So I'm going to try to get it done as soon as possible. But the average was 67, and I'm not going to be talking all that much about grades on the individual exams anymore. I'm going to be focusing on your overall grade in the class because we now have 3 exams and attendance points to work with. So what we're going to focus on is giving you where you stand if you don't take the final. And let me see what we got here. Can we do that? Okay. No. All right. So you can pick up your exam in my office hours or in class or in lab, and just come on and get it. Some people did really well, and some people did a little bit better, but not as much as I would like to see. But anyway, we'll have more to say about that when I actually work through the grade distribution for the class standing rather than this individual exam. So taking your 3 scores plus attendance and combining them to see what grade I would be assigning at this point will be way more meaningful now than looking at individual test scores. So today is the last lab. If you are the last live lab, if you are coming to lab today, there are 2 things that you can do. You can either meet me at the entrance to the cemetery on Esplanade Avenue at about 1:20. And if you don't know how to get there or you're not confident about getting there, come to Bio 216 at 1 o'clock and we'll get you oriented and we'll drive down there together. Whatever you do, don't use a navigation aid on your phone or anything because it will take you to a place where you literally cannot drive. There will be police saying, "What are you doing here? Turn around." So don't do that. Follow the map that's posted or come to 216 and get directions. Okay. So we've now covered a couple of topics in community ecology, and we're going to now look at small scale diversity patterns in communities and what regulates them. This, as I alluded to a couple of lectures ago, is probably the single most important question about ecological communities. What species are present and how many are present and why those particular species are present. So we're going to distinguish between biotic and abiotic factors that regulate the number of species in a community. The biotic factors we refer to as equilibrium hypotheses. Okay, and that's despite the fact that some of the abiotic factors may have equilibrium. The reason that we call these equilibrium hypotheses is because they have to do with those equilibria that we saw on the graphs of competition and predation. So remember, there are stable and unstable equilibria that competitors and predator-prey systems can have. All right, well, that's the equilibrium we're talking about here. And so it is an equilibrium that is generated by the interaction of species. So that's why it's biotic. It has to do with the species that you're interacting with. It does not have to do with the physical environment. So there are three ideas about how you can get more species into a community, and that is the amount of niche space, the degree to which you allow niches to overlap, and the degree of specialization that you can tolerate in a community. So we'll take each of these in turn. Two of these have really strong support. One of them is found very, very infrequently, but they're all found in nature. And we have to ask ourselves when we look at a particular community, is there a possibility that one of these explanations could be the dominant one to explain how many species we have in a couple of communities that differ a little bit? The interactions with the physical environment are abiotic factors, and so abiotic regulating factors also can play a role in the number of species in a community. We refer to these as non-equilibrium hypotheses, and this is just a historical thing, because when we were first thinking about this in the mid-60s and 70s of the last century, the dominant thinking at the time was that equilibria between competitors and predator-prey were probably explaining most of what we saw. So that's where the equilibrium comes from. And then these are then the non-equilibrium hypotheses, the things that don't have to do with interactions among species. That's despite the fact that there is an equilibrium in at least one of them, which we'll see. So the three that have the strongest support are resource availability, the complexity or heterogeneity of the environment, and disturbance. And some of these will sound rather similar to aspects of the equilibrium hypotheses. We'll try to make the distinction and talk about how you would distinguish a pattern that looks, consistent with both environmental complexity and greater niche space. So we'll spend a little time on that. Okay, but first, oops, and I see that we need to get our, there we go. First, let's look at the general scheme of the equilibrium hypotheses. So this little cartoon kind of summarizes the way we think about those three ideas. So it's the ability to have more species could be due to increased resource diversity, that is a longer niche axis. And so here you, an A on top, you have a niche axis that goes this far, but in B, it goes further. And that allows for more species to be supported in that community. All right, so what might we be talking about? Well, we might be talking about a salinity gradient that goes from, say, 0 parts per thousand in totally fresh water to maybe 10 parts per thousand in brackish water. Okay, so that would be one community. But in a different community, you might have a salinity gradient that's much broader, from 0 parts per thousand all the way to 10 again, and then all the way to like 15 or 18. All right, well, the greater richness of the second environment in terms of simply the availability of resources on our resource axis would allow for more species to be found in that second community. So one question then is, when we compare communities that have different numbers of species, one of the first things we ask is, well, is there any evidence that there are more resources available in the one with more species? A second thing that can generate this is increased ecological overlap. Okay, and here's an example of packing 8 species into the same space where we had 5 species up here by allowing them to overlap more. All right, now what do we know about niche overlap? It's bad for individuals. It reduces their fitness. So people have been very skeptical about niche overlap as an explanation for increased diversity. In fact, there's at least one instance in which we know that this is probably what's going on, but this one is not very well supported in most communities. Okay, the third then is increased specialization. So once again, we're squeezing 8 species into an area where we had 5 to begin with up here. But in D, notice the range of resource use is much lower than it is up at the top. So these species would be considered more specialized. They use a smaller range of the available resources. So this little cartoon is very useful to keep in the back of your mind when we're talking about this, because it summarizes real succinctly the 3 arguments about how interactions between species might affect the diversity of a community. And of course, what we're looking at here is a competition, right? We don't really have a predation kind of equivalent here, but what we're arguing is that if there are more ways to escape predators, even if there are more predators, then maybe increased resource diversity might be an argument, even though we're not talking about resources that species are competing for. If we're looking at greater specialization in evasive strategies here than here, then that could be the equivalent of a greater specialization in terms of predator-prey interactions. Okay, so although we frame this particular slide in terms of competition, kind of the idea is extendable to other kinds of interactions. And of course, I haven't said anything about mutualism at all here, but the idea is that interactions between species can have these forms and can potentially explain which community has the greater number of species. So let's have a look at some of the patterns that make us think that these are reasonable explanations. This is one of the oldest ones. This is from work by James Brown, who at the time was at UCLA. He then went to Arizona, where he was my advisor briefly, and then moved to the University of New Mexico, where he's now a professor emeritus. He's still supervising students, but he looked at rat communities in the Great Basin Desert and the Sonoran Desert. And what he found was there was this range of seed sizes. Gee, that's the first time we've heard about a range of seed sizes, isn't it? So he was struck by the parallels to the Galapagos finch story and thought, I wonder, could the range of seed sizes explain the range of rodent sizes in these 2 deserts? Now, as it turns out, the range of seed sizes is approximately the same. And so that made him look at this differently than Peter Grant was looking at the Galapagos finches. He said, well, okay, if the range of seed sizes is about the same, do we see approximately the same differences among the species that are coexisting? So do we have a small species, a large species, a middle species? And are they about the same distance apart in morphology? And this is what he found. He found that, in fact, there were 6 species in the Sonoran Desert and 5 in the Great Basin. And there was actually quite a remarkable correspondence between the relative sizes of these rodents. There was a tiny rodent in both cases, about 72 grams, or 7.1 or 7.2 grams. There was a slightly larger rodent, a little over 10 grams in both cases. There was a kind of small medium rodent in both cases, and there was a real large one in both cases and a sort of medium large one in both cases. The one difference happened to be this one in the middle in the Sonoran Desert. And there happens to be quite a lot of seeds in the range that this animal would use in the Sonoran Desert, but many fewer such seeds in the Great Basin Desert, just because of the kinds of plants that are growing there. So there's extra resources in this area in the Sonoran Desert that are lacking in the Great Basin Desert. And he proposed, well, we've got this extra species here because there's enough of these seeds to support them coexisting. But this is really remarkable. You have 120 and 100, and the ratio between 120 and 45 is virtually identical to the ratio between 101 and 37. So if you look at the ratios of body sizes, they're almost identical in both deserts. And that suggests that competition, in fact, does structure these communities. So it would be reasonable then to ask what structures communities that have different numbers of species. If it's reasonable that biotic interactions could do this, then we have 3 ways in which they could do this. Okay, which of them can we find support for? All right, well, character displacement then is the idea that you have greater specialization when you have greater numbers of species. And of course, we've seen this in the Galapagos finches. Now, in the Galapagos finches, we're only talking about 2 or maybe 3 finches coexisting versus 1. But in desert lizard communities, and in fact, lizard communities around the world, you can have anywhere from 1 or 2 to 30. And as it turns out, yes, we find evidence that these animals are more specialized in communities that they share with other species. So greater specialization through character displacement seems to be a pretty powerful explanation for species differences between communities. Here's an example. We have an Anolis lizard here that lives in the Bahamas? Yeah, the Bahamas. Jarabacoa is one of the Bahamas. Okay, and so this is a species that lives in a community where there are other Anolis lizards. Okay, there are 5 other lizards. All right, and this is the distribution of prey lengths that it uses. Okay. All right, Anolis marmoratus here at the bottom is the only species found on its island. And it is pretty clear that Anolis cybotes here on the top is more specialized in a community with 4 other lizard species than Anolis marmoratus is here on the bottom, where it's got the entire island to itself. Again, this is another natural experiment, right? So it's not definitive proof that this happened because we didn't see it happen in evolutionary time. And there could be other differences among the islands. But this pattern is so consistent, so striking among so many species and so many communities that it really seems like there's strong support for character displacement causing greater specialization in communities that have more species. We just see it over and over and over again. Right? What about niche space? Remember, we had one situation where we had 5 species on a niche axis that was so long, and then we had 8 species on a niche axis that was much longer. What kind of real world examples do we see that might make us think that niche space, the ability to subdivide the environment, affects the number of species? In this case, if there's more resources to divide up, you wouldn't necessarily have to be more specialized. You could be pretty much the same in both communities, whether or not you were competing with large or small numbers of other species. If in a community that's richer, you were dividing up more different kinds of resources. Well, this is actually kind of hard to show, but one thing that tells us something really profound about the way that animals or organisms use their environment is their morphology. Okay, and bats are a classic study system for this kind of analysis. And it's because their wing shape and their head shape tell you what they're doing. Species that have long wings are generally flying long distances, and they're not very maneuverable, so they're not twisting and turning. They're flying like large birds. And basically, those guys are eating fruit. They're flying from their roost to a fruit tree that may be a long distance away, and they're eating fruit. Okay, and their faces are different from those of other bats. The fox-faced bats, the fruit bats in Australia that so many of you are now aware of because of Instagram, they're actually very cute. Those are fruit bats, okay? And their faces look a little like dogs. And their wings are really long and really powerful. Okay, insectivorous bats look totally different. They have short, broad wings because they're not flying long distances. They are twisting and turning in tropical rainforests generally, trying to chase down insects. And so they need to be very maneuverable. They don't need long wings. Long wings would make it impossible for them to catch insects. Also, their faces are totally different. Their faces are adapted for echolocation, meaning that their ears are huge. They sometimes have dish-shaped faces to facilitate getting ultrasound echoes back from insects that they're trying to catch. So if we look at things like the ear length and the forearm, that will tell us something about how dependent they are on echolocation. If we look at the ratio of these digits here, that tells us how long the wing is. And so we can have species that have big ears relative to their wing size. Those are insectivores. We could have species that have small ears relative to their wing. Those are probably fruit eaters. The ratio of the digits tells you exactly how long and thin the wing is. So you can tell if a bat species has a very short, stubby wing that's terrific for maneuvering, or a long, more thinner, powerful wing that's good for powered flight over long distances. And so what we've got here at the bottom then is the ratio of ear to forearm. on one axis and the ratio of the digits on the other axis. And we've graphed the morphology of bats from West Africa in the light blue and the bats from Canada in the dark blue. And notice there are not many bats in Canada. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 species of bats in Canada. End of story. There are a whole lot more bats in Cameroon. And then the question is, well, is that because there are more types of resources in Cameroon? Is there more niche space? Okay, well, let's notice something about how close the dots are here. The dots are really close in some cases, meaning that they might be kind of specialized, but notice that there's no consistent difference between Cameroon and Canada in how close or far apart those dots are. The bats in Canada are not more generalized. They have the same degree of specialization as the bats in Africa. What's different is that there are a whole lot more options for bats in Africa than there are in Canada. Basically, there's one species of bat in Canada that eats fruit. And all the others over here are insectivores. But get a load of this. Look at how diverse the African bats are. You have this whole cluster of bats way over here on the right-hand side of the graph that specialize on different kinds of fruit, because there are a huge number of fruiting tree species in Africa. You have all kinds of insectivores in Africa because there are probably 10 to 20 times the number of flying insect species in Africa than there are in Canada. Basically, in Canada, you have mosquitoes. And you don't have to take my word for it. Just go up there some August and try to sit outside for more than 10 minutes at a time. It's really tough. So in this case, the morphology here tells us that the spaces between the points are not different in these two communities. That means that there's not more specialization in the more diverse community. Character displacement is not having the main effect here. But what we see is that the diversity of morphology is hugely different because there are so many more ways to make a living in Africa than there are in Canada, for bats anyway. So this is powerful evidence that niche space, the availability of a diversity of resources, can affect the diversity of a community. There are more bat species in Africa because there are more resources that bats can use in Africa. So those two things, niche space and character displacement causing specialization, are really, really common in nature. And some of our best evidence for niche space actually comes from bats, because once people saw this, they said, oh, well, we've got to do more studies of this. So there are umpteen studies of bat communities that show this very pattern. And there are some species of other, some studies of other species that show similar patterns, but this is kind of a fad in ecology, studying bats for this. Okay, so what about the greater niche overlap? I said that we know that that's kind of unstable. And there was recently one demonstration that increased overlap can cause greater community diversity. It happens to be a study that was done at LSU in the benthic system just off the mouth of the river, looking at communities that decay wood that's fallen to the floor of the Gulf of Mexico. And pieces of wood that shelter more species don't differ terribly from the ones that shelter few species. But as it turns out, the species that are decaying the wood in large communities are simply just overlapping their niches in ways that we sort of did not expect. Okay, so there are a few such studies. As far as I know, they're all aquatic species or marine species communities in which greater niche overlap does occur, but it's not common. And we know that it's not common probably because it affects the fitness of each species competing negatively. And so you'd expect that there'd be a greater risk for extinction of one or more of those species in which there's high overlap. And so you'd lose the diversity of the community. We think that you can have this pattern at least for a little while. Studies are ongoing at LSU about whether you can have this consistently. So for now, we have extremely strong support for character displacement causing specialization. We have extremely strong support for greater niche space, providing more opportunities for species without having to make them more specialized. And we have a little bit of support from a couple of studies for greater niche overlap. I don't think we're going to find a lot more support for greater niche overlap. It's just too unstable, but it has been shown at least once or twice. So these are the equilibrium hypotheses. There's strong support for 2 of the 3, and we know that the third one is not impossible, but we just don't know how stable those communities actually are. So let's now turn our attention to the abiotic factors and look at non-equilibrium hypotheses. And that's resource availability, environmental complexity, or sometimes called heterogeneity, and disturbance, and see how they might affect the diversity of a local community. Well, all right. So increasing resource availability causes a crash in the number of species. The greater the resource availability, the more extinction there is, and the fewer species persist. Here's an experiment that started in 1856 and is still going on today. 1856, they started fertilizing pastures in England. And at that time, there were 49 species in that community. So 49 species of grasses and herbs. Okay, by 1862, that had dropped to 28, kind of surprisingly. And look at the rank abundance curve. What's happened to it? One species has become more dominant, and the slope has become steeper, meaning that the rare species have become rarer. Okay, and you've lost 20 species altogether. 1872, you got even fewer species. Only 16 were left. By the turn of the century, there were only 10 left. And in 1949, there were only 3 left. If you went back to those pastures today, there'd be 1 species. And that's all from fertilizing these pastures. Okay, why did we lose all those species? You would think, I think logically, that adding resources here would make it possible for more species to coexist. And instead, only 1 came to dominate the community. Well, it's not like you are enhancing every potential resource in this community. You're doing one thing. You are adding 1 resource, nitrogen. And so the weedy species that do best in a high nitrogen environment quickly crowded out the other species that are adapted to lower levels of nitrogen. And the one that happens to be left today is a total weed. And it just takes that nitrogen and puts it into many millions of seeds and just dominates the community. So resource abundance is not necessarily a good thing for communities. Resource diversity is, as we saw from the greater niche space idea in the equilibrium slide. Okay, but what that's doing is increasing the range of different resources. What we're doing here is just dumping a single resource into a community, and that favors one or a few species over all the others. This pattern is really common. As it turns out, diversity tends to peak at intermediate levels of resource availability in some communities. So at really low levels of resource availability, there's not that many species. Okay, just because primary production is so low, there just isn't enough energy being produced because there's not enough resources to make the enzymes required to do photosynthesis. So if you add some resources, initially you get an increase in diversity, but then if you keep adding that resource, it drops off. So here we're adding phosphorus and potassium to the soil. And as you increase phosphorus and potassium in the soil, you get an initial increase and then a rapid drop off. Okay. And here in B, in A, this is Malaysian rainforest trees. In B, this is South African plants. And so if you increase potassium, oh no, this is a measure of production, so a measure of soil fertility here. And you see that you get a peak in the number of species at intermediate levels of soil fertility. Really fertile soils, though, are dominated by only a few species, the weeds. It's not just plants. Here in C, we have desert rodents. And what we see is desert rodents peak in abundance or peak in diversity where you have intermediate levels of rainfall. And really high levels of rainfall cause a drop-off in the number of species. That's because some of the plants that are producing the seeds are adapted to high rainfall patterns and others are not. If you increase the rainfall, you're just favoring the few plants that are adapted to that, and they outcompete all the other plants. And so the rodents that depend on those other plants die out. And you only have the rodents that can eat the seeds of the plants that are adapted to these high rainfall situations. So it doesn't matter what kind of habitat it is, you see this peak at intermediate levels here. And it's because the weeds are always out producing everybody else in the community when you increase one resource and one resource only. Okay, now, sometimes you don't see an intermediate peak. Sometimes you just see a monotonic decline. So look, here in Ghana, in the rainforest, you see the most species in the least fertile areas. And as soil fertility increases, you get fewer and fewer plants. That's because the weeds are doing better and better and better. So if your resource pool is really, really, really poor, adding a resource can initially increase diversity. But inevitably, if you continue to increase the availability of that resource, you will start to see species extinctions and diversity will decline. I think to most people, this is very counterintuitive. It's not what you expect. Okay, what about complexity or heterogeneity, as we sometimes call it? That's simply the ability to, say, hide from other species or to grab some particular kind of area for yourself that other species don't find. Well, here are the four of the five warblers that Robert MacArthur worked on in his dissertation, where we talked about ecological segregation, and here are some others. And look at the abundance of these guys versus the volume of foliage. Okay, so what the heck is this? So this is above 6 meters. This is the diversity of trees. So the more foliage you have in terms of trees, that is, the more trees you have, and the more diversity of trees that you have, the more of these guys you can support. So you can support 5 or more warbler species if you have a tall tree community. These forests are not really diverse. They don't have more types of insects. All that's going on is that they have a greater volume of trees to subdivide. Down here, you don't really have a lot of trees. Up here, you have a lot of trees. So there are more ways for these warblers to carve out an opportunity for themselves. And so the more heterogeneous the environment is, the more species you can support. Now, it's important to understand that some of these warblers do persist at relatively in relatively simple environments where there are no trees. So the black-throated green and yellow-rumped warblers, they occur in grasslands and shrublands. You just can't have these other ones unless you have a more complex environment. So there's an alternate way to graph this that has been tried with other bird communities. And here you have foliage height diversity. So what we're doing here is asking, if we take a pole and we extend it up into the forest, how many leaves does that pole touch at a given height? The more leaves it touches at a given height, the greater the foliage height diversity. So this is a measure of the volume of foliage available, and is very similar in concept to the graph that we just saw. But here is a much broader survey of plant communities and a survey of the bird species that inhabit them. And the more complex the forest is, the more bird species you have. And notice that this is not 1, 2, and 3 species. This is the Shannon-Weaver index. So the difference between 1 and 2 is a lot of species. So for bird communities, greater heterogeneity of the environment definitely increases the number of species. Okay. In fact, resource heterogeneity can explain seemingly incomprehensible patterns of species diversity. For a long time, we looked at lakes and we said, how can they support all of these plankton species? There are all these plankton species in these lakes, and the lakes don't look like they're at all heterogeneous. They just look like lakes. Looks like the water in this part of the lake is exactly the same as the water in that part of the lake. So how the heck are all these plankton species coexisting? Well, it turns out that that's our bias as people who are about 5, 6 feet tall, and who don't look at communities in the same way that the plankton are looking at them. Here's an example from Walker Lake in Nevada, showing you how nitrate concentrations vary over the surface of the lake. Well, look at that. That's way more heterogeneous than you'd expect. And here's a different nutrient, silicate. All right, so these organisms require silicates for their skeletons, and they require nitrogen for their tissues. And you can see that when you superimpose these things, you have a really heterogeneous lake that looks for all the world to us, just sort of looking at the lake, as if nothing's going on. So the plankton are seeing heterogeneity that is not obvious to us. And in some areas of the lake, you have high nitrogen and relatively medium silica. In other areas, you have medium nitrogen and medium silica or low silica. In other areas of the lake, you have relatively low nitrogen and high silica. There's all kinds of ways for these guys to subdivide this lake. So the heterogeneity of the environment is actually extremely important in determining the number of species. It's sometimes not obvious to people when we look at these environments, though. Okay, so here's many, many, many examples of heterogeneity. On the x-axis, in each case is some measure of how diverse or how heterogeneous the environment is in some way. So this is plant diversity, and here's the number of fish species in an aquatic system. The more heterogeneous the bottom of the stream is, the more fish species you get. Well, surprise. Here's vegetation height diversity, and here's bird species yet again for a third time, and you see that it increases. It's all kinds of things, though. Down here at the bottom, you have number of substrate types, from mud to silt to sand to rock. The more types of substrate you have, the more mollusk species you have. The more plants you have, the greater the lizard diversity, okay? And here's the structural diversity of those plants. By far the strongest relationship between the number of lizard species and the plant community is how diverse the structure of the plants is. There's a positive relationship here with species diversity, but there's a much stronger relationship here. The structural diversity out here at the edge on the x-axis includes grasses, herbs, shrubs, trees. And over here, it's pretty much just grasses and herbs. So heterogeneity is really important. Okay, finally, disturbance. Okay, and there is an equilibrium here that I wanted to point out. So it's not as if there's not an equilibrium in the non-equilibrium hypotheses, it's that we think of it differently. Okay, so think about the species that are early successional species, right? They look for open space, they're quick to grab it, and then the late successional species come in and out-compete them. So if you have disturbance, you can maintain both kinds of species in the community. You have greater diversity. So large, frequent, and severe disturbances tend to kill off the late successional species. And so you get low diversity because only the early successional species can persist because they're constantly getting destroyed, and they're the only ones that can persist under those conditions. If you have infrequent, small disturbances, then you're going to allow the competitive species to drive the early successional species to extinction. But kind of in the Goldilocks zone where you have intermediate disturbance frequency, where the return time of disturbances is not too early and not too late, kind of Goldilocks, and where the size is not consistently enormous or not consistently tiny, you provide opportunities for all of the species in the successional sequence to coexist. So you get high diversity at intermediate disturbance levels. Okay, this is very, very common. It was first discovered on coral reefs by Joseph Connell, who did much of the work on the intertidal that we've been talking about. And Dan Jansen in the tropical rainforest read that paper and said the same thing is happening here. So we call this the Jansen-Connell hypothesis, or the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. So we have very strong evidence for all three of these abiotic regulating factors that control the diversity of communities. Okay. Here is an example of an experimental system that's really, really simple and easy to understand. In an exposed rocky shore where you have lots and lots of disturbance, the highly exposed rocks have the lowest diversity, but you can support some other species if there's less disturbance. In areas that are protected from waves crashing on them all the time, the most diverse community is found in the middle zone, where you get enough wave action to prevent the dominant competitor from taking over, but not so much that it can't exist with the others. So you get all three of these types of species in the intermediate disturbance area. With higher levels of disturbance, you lose some. With lower levels of disturbance, you lose some. So intermediate disturbance really does work. Okay, that's all we're going to say about local communities then. We will come back and talk about the global diversity patterns in another lecture, the patterns of diversity from poles to equator. Those are a much larger spatial scale than what we're talking about here. So 3 equilibrium and 3 non-equilibrium hypotheses do a lot of explaining about what we see in nature. There's actually like 10 or 12 different non-equilibrium hypotheses. People have thrown all kinds of stuff out there, but it's like throwing spaghetti at a wall. Sometimes they stick and sometimes they don't. These are the 3 that have stuck the best. Okay. So that's all we've got for today. I will see a few of you in lab this afternoon. It'll be a beautiful afternoon to associate with dead people. So come prepared. If you haven't picked up your exam and you're here, come on and get it. And I'm going to call for any questions. If I don't hear questions, we're going to end this for everybody. Okay, guys, we'll get this posted as soon as possible. And we'll see you soon.